The day Jasper Thatcher rode into the dusty town of Millhaven, Texas, in the summer of 1874, he did not intend to fall in love. He only meant to buy flour, rest his horse, and move on before nightfall. But fate, as it so often does in the wide-open country of the American Southwest, had a different set of plans entirely. Millhaven was not much to look at. It was the kind of town that had been built quickly and carelessly, the way most frontier settlements were, thrown together with raw timber and ambition, and a collective refusal to admit how unforgiving the land truly was. There was a saloon with a crooked sign above the door, a post office that doubled as a general store, a livery stable that smelled powerfully of horses and manure and old hay, a sheriff's office with bars on the windows, and a handful of small homes that lined the single main road like teeth in an uneven jaw. The sun hammered down on all of it without mercy, baking the dust into a pale, cracked crust that rose in small clouds with every footfall and every gust of wind that came rolling in from the direction of the flatlands to the south. Jasper was 27 years old, broad-shouldered, and lean in the way that men get when they spend most of their lives outdoors doing physical work. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends when the humidity was up, and eyes the color of strong coffee, and a jaw that had not seen a proper razor in the better part of 2 weeks. He rode a chestnut gelding named Copperhead, which was a fearsome name for an animal that was actually quite gentle and fond of being scratched behind the ears. Jasper had been working cattle drives for the last 4 years, moving herds north along the Kisham Trail and back again, spending long months under the open sky with no company but other cowboys and the slow, lowing movement of thousands of cattle. He was good at the work. He was reliable and honest and did not drink to excess or gamble away money he did not have, and foremen valued him accordingly. But he was also, beneath the rough exterior that the life required of him, profoundly lonely in a way he rarely let himself acknowledge, because acknowledging it would only make the loneliness heavier. He tied Copperhead at the post outside the general store and went in to buy what he needed. The storekeeper, a barrel-chested man named Mr. Holt, was filling an order at the back counter and called out for Jasper to help himself and bring his items forward when he was ready. Jasper took a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, some dried jerky, and a small paper bag of hard candy that he bought for no reason he could clearly articulate, except that they were there and they were red, and they reminded him of something pleasant from his childhood that he could not quite name. It was while he was waiting at the counter for Mr. Holt to finish tallying the figures that he noticed the dress. It was hanging on a wooden form near the window at the front of the store, catching the late afternoon light in a way that made it appear almost luminous. It was blue, not a pale or watery blue, but a deep, rich, almost impossible blue, the blue of a clear sky just after a summer storm has passed and the air has been washed clean and everything in the world looks brighter than it has any right to. The dress had been made with obvious skill and care. The seams were straight and precise, the collar was edged with delicate white fabric, and the skirt fell in soft, graceful folds that suggested both practicality and beauty. Jasper was not a man who ordinarily paid much attention to women's clothing, but he stood and looked at that dress for a long moment with a feeling he could not name rising quietly in his chest. "Something catch your eye, Mr. Holt said, appearing behind the counter and noticing the direction of Jasper's gaze. "That dress," Jasper said. "Did someone make it here in town?" "Mrs. Pemberton made it," Mr. Holt said, nodding toward the far end of the building where a narrow door connected the general store to the small dressmaking shop that operated out of the adjacent space. "She runs the dress shop next door. Fine seamstress, best in 3 counties, though she'd be the last person to say so." "Is it sold?" Mr. Holt gave him an amused look. "It's ordered, yes. Woman came in about 3 weeks ago and commissioned it special. Paid half up front, supposed to pick it up this week sometime." Jasper looked at the dress again. Something about it nagged at him in a way he could not shake, a feeling almost like recognition, which made no sense at all since he had never seen the dress before and knew nothing about the woman who had ordered it. "Do you know anything about her?" he asked before he had fully decided to ask. "The woman who ordered it." Mr. Holt blinked at him. "Why do you want to know about her?" Jasper did not have a good answer for that. He scratched the back of his neck and looked out the window at the empty street and then back at the dress and said, "I don't know. She has good taste." Mr. Holt looked at him for a moment with the measuring expression of a man who has seen a great many people pass through his store and has learned to read them with some accuracy. Then he shook his head in a mild sort of way and said, "Mrs. Pemberton would know better than me. She's the one who talked with her." Jasper paid for his goods, stacked them beside the door, and he could not entirely explain the impulse, he walked through the narrow connecting door into the dressmaking shop. The shop was small and warm and smelled of fabric and lavender water, and something faintly sweet that he could not identify. Every surface was covered with the tools and materials of the trade. Spools of thread in dozens of colors, bolts of fabric standing upright in a row like colorful soldiers, a dressmaker's form in the corner draped with a half-finished bodice, a cutting table with marks and measurements scratched into the wood from years of use. There were fashion plates pinned to one wall, illustrations from Eastern magazines showing the current styles, though Mrs. Pemberton had clearly adapted them for the realities of frontier life, where a woman needed to be able to breathe and move and work as well as look presentable. Mrs. Pemberton herself was seated at a treadle sewing machine near the window, working on a length of brown wool with rapid, practiced movements. She was a small woman of perhaps 55 years, with white hair pinned neatly at the back of her head and sharp, bright eyes behind small round spectacles. She looked up when Jasper came in and regarded him with the calm assessment of a woman who had seen just about everything and was surprised by very little. "You're not here for a dress fitting," she said pleasantly. "No, ma'am," Jasper agreed. "I was next door buying supplies and I saw the blue dress in the window. Mr. Holt said it was your work." "It is," Mrs. Pemberton said. She kept her hands moving on the fabric but did not take her eyes from him. "It's commissioned work, not for sale to anyone else, so if that's what you're after, I'm afraid I can't help you." "I'm not after the dress," Jasper said, and then paused because he was not entirely sure what he was after, and standing in this quiet, warm shop full of beautiful things, he felt suddenly large and out of place in his worn trail clothes and his dusty boots. "I wondered if you might tell me something about the woman who ordered it, the woman it belongs to." Mrs. Pemberton stopped working. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him directly for a long moment. "Why would I tell a stranger about one of my customers?" she said, not unkindly but with a clear measure of caution in her voice. "I don't know," Jasper said honestly. That dress is something, and I reckon the woman who chose it must be something too. I don't mean any harm by it. I'm passing through, and I suppose I'm a curious sort." Mrs. Pemberton continued to study him. She had a remarkable ability to be still and quiet while she assessed someone, and Jasper held her gaze without fidgeting, which seemed to count in his favor. "You're a cattle man," she said finally. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am, I do trail work. I've been running cattle since I was 19. Decent work." "Hard work," he said, "but honest." She nodded slowly, as though this satisfied some internal calculation she had been performing. Then she reached up and removed her spectacles and cleaned them thoughtfully on the hem of her apron. "Her name is Clara Sawyer," Mrs. Pemberton said, and something in the air of the small shop seemed to shift subtly, though Jasper could not have explained what he meant by that. "She is 24 years old, and she lives on a homestead claim about 12 miles northeast of here, just past the creek they call Archer's Fork. She came in alone, which told me something about her right there, because women do not usually ride 12 miles alone into town in this country without good reason and a certain kind of steadiness to them." Jasper listened without interrupting, leaning slightly against the doorframe with his hat held in both hands. "She is a tall woman," Mrs. Pemberton continued, with the quiet precision of someone used to measuring the human form. Slender but strong. Brown hair, quite long, though she wore it pinned back practically, not fancily. Her hands were calloused, which told me she does real work. Her face, Mrs. Pemberton paused and looked out the window for a moment with a slightly faraway expression. Her face is the kind that you remember after you've looked at it, which is saying something. She has green eyes. Not common green, not hazel, but a true, clear green, like new leaves in spring. And she has a way of looking at you directly when she speaks that makes you feel as though she is genuinely paying attention to what you say, which in my experience is rarer than it ought to be. Jasper's hands tightened slightly on the brim of his hat, but he kept his face still. She chose that blue herself, Mrs. Pemberton went on. I offered her half a dozen fabrics and she went straight to that one without hesitating. I asked her if she was sure because that shade is bold, not everyone can carry it, and she looked at it for a moment and then said yes, that was the one. She was right, for the record. It will suit her very well. Jasper was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does she have family on that homestead?" "She said she was alone," Mrs. Pemberton said, and she watched him carefully as she said it. "Her husband died 2 years ago. Fever," she said. "She has been working the land herself since then." There was a brief silence in which the only sound was the wind pressing lightly against the shop window. "She is not a woman in need of rescuing, if that's what you're thinking," Mrs. Pemberton added, with a firmness that was not unkind. She was perfectly clear about who she was and what she was about. She didn't say a word about loneliness or need. She came in, she ordered a dress, she paid half the price in coin she had earned herself, and she rode back home. But she did tell me one thing. "What was that?" "She said she ordered it because she wanted something beautiful," Mrs. Pemberton said softly. "Not for any occasion, not for any particular purpose. Just because she had been working very hard for 2 years and she had not allowed herself anything beautiful, and she thought perhaps it was time." Jasper stood with that for a moment. He looked at the blue dress through the connecting doorway, visible from where he stood in the soft light of the afternoon, and he felt something move in him that was genuine and quiet and unexpectedly powerful. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," he said. "She is," Mrs. Pemberton said simply. "So whatever you're considering, you should consider carefully." Jasper thanked her. He went back through the door and collected his supplies from where he had left them near the entrance. He put them into his saddlebags and stood for a moment beside Copperhead in the empty street with his hand resting on the horse's neck, and the sun lowering slowly toward the horizon in the west, painting the sky in shades of amber and deep rose. He had no reason to ride 12 miles northeast. He had no right to show up on a widow woman's homestead uninvited, a stranger off the trail. He had flour and coffee and jerky and a bag of hard red candy and a horse that needed rest. He stood there for a long while, thinking. Then he cinched the saddlebags tight, swung up into the saddle, and turned Copperhead's head northeast. He told himself that he was just curious, that he would ride out that way and see the country and perhaps turn back before he got anywhere near Archer's Fork. He told himself all of this with great conviction, while Copperhead moved steadily through the afternoon heat, following the road that led out of Millhaven and into the open land beyond, where the grass grew in long pale waves, and the sky was enormous, and the wind moved through everything like a slow, living breath. The land northeast of Millhaven was beautiful in the way that the Texas hill country could be beautiful when you looked at it right, not soft or easy, but wide and clear and honest, with long views in every direction, and the occasional dark line of trees marking the course of a watercourse below. The late afternoon light lay across the grass like something warm and golden, and the air smelled of dust and wild sage, and the faint green smell of the creek that he could hear before he could see it. He crossed Archer's Fork at a shallow place where the water ran clear over flat limestone, and Copperhead drank while Jasper looked at the country ahead. About a mile further on, set against a low rise that broke the wind from the north, he could see a small homestead, a house built from limestone blocks, a barn with a patched roof, a kitchen garden, a corral with a pair of horses in it, and a windmill that turned slowly in the evening breeze. Smoke was rising from the chimney in a thin, straight line. He sat on his horse at the edge of the creek and looked at the homestead for a long while. He was thinking about what Mrs. Pemberton had said. About a woman who had worked alone for 2 years and allowed herself nothing beautiful. About green eyes and calloused hands, and the way a person could choose a dress, not because they needed it, but because they had decided they deserved something lovely. He was also thinking about the fact that he had ridden 12 miles on the strength of a dress and a description, and that when he arrived at that house, the woman inside it would be well within her rights to run him off with a rifle, which she almost certainly owned and probably knew how to use. He rode forward anyway. There was a gate at the entrance to the property, a simple affair of wooden rails strung with wire, and he dismounted and opened it and led Copperhead through and refastened it behind him, because a man who left gates open in cattle country was not a man worth knowing. He remounted and walked the horse slowly up toward the house, staying in clear view, not hurrying. He had ridden enough through settled country to know that you approached a homestead openly and without surprise, and you called out when you were still some distance away, because people in the frontier territories were alert to strangers for very good reason. "Hello, the house," he called, when he was about 50 yards out. There was a pause. Then the door of the house opened, and a woman appeared on the narrow porch, and she was holding a shotgun in both hands, not raised but held at a clear state of readiness, and he understood immediately that she was neither afraid nor careless. She was exactly what Mrs. Pemberton had described, tall and slender and strong-looking, with brown hair pinned back at the neck, wearing a plain work dress that was practical and worn, and even from 50 yards Jasper could see that her eyes were extraordinary. "That's close enough," she said. Her voice was clear and steady. "Who are you and what's your business?" "My name is Jasper Thatcher," he said, staying on the horse, keeping his hands visible. "I'm a cattle man just passing through Millhaven. I went into the general store today and I saw a blue dress hanging in the window, and I asked the dressmaker about it, and she told me about you." There was a silence that stretched out across the warm evening air between them. Clara Sawyer did not lower the shotgun, but she tilted her head slightly in a way that suggested she was listening. "Mrs. Pemberton told a stranger about me," she said, and there was something in her voice that was more surprised than alarmed. "She did," Jasper said. "She was careful about it. She wanted to know I wasn't a bad sort before she said a word. I think she sized me up pretty thoroughly." Another pause. "What exactly did she tell you?" "That you're a widow working a homestead alone," he said. "That you have good taste in color, and that you ordered a dress not because you had somewhere to be, but because you decided you had earned something beautiful." The gun did not waver, but something in Clara's expression shifted fractionally, some careful arrangement of features that had been set to neutrality moving slightly in a direction he could not quite read from this distance. "And that made you ride 12 miles, she said. "Yes, ma'am. That's an odd thing to do." "Yes, ma'am," he agreed. "I'm aware of that." Clara stood on her porch and looked at him for a long time. The windmill turned. The evening birds began to call in the trees by the creek. Copperhead stood absolutely still in the way that well-trained horses do when their rider is tense and paying attention. "Get down off your horse," Clara said finally. "I'll not talk to a man I have to squint up at, but stay where you are until I say otherwise." He dismounted. He looped Copperhead's reins over the fence post at the edge of the yard and stood with his hat in his hands, in clear view in the open yard, and waited. Clara came down off the porch. She lowered the shotgun, but she did not put it down, and he noted with something like admiration that she handled it comfortably, the way a person handles a tool they have long been accustomed to. She walked across the yard toward him with an unhurried, even stride, and as she got closer, he could see that everything Mrs. Pemberton had said was accurate and also insufficient. Because Clara Sawyer was not simply a striking or memorable woman in the way that the dressmaker had described. She was the kind of person who seemed to be fully, uncomplicatedly present in herself, without artifice or performance, and that quality, Jasper thought, was far rarer than green eyes or good bone structure. She stopped about 10 feet from him and looked at him directly, exactly the way Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned. "Jasper Thatcher," she said, as though testing the name to see if it held up. "Yes, ma'am. You can stop saying yes, ma'am. I'm not your school teacher." Something moved in his chest that might have been the beginning of a smile. "All right." She studied him for a moment more. "What did you intend to do when you got here? You must have had some idea." He was honest with her. "I didn't have much of a plan," he said. "I just had the feeling I needed to come. I can't explain it better than that." "That's not much of an explanation." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Clara looked at him for another moment, then she looked at Copperhead and she said, "Your horse needs water. Go ahead and bring him around to the trough by the barn. You can put him in the corral if you like. My horses won't mind the company." It was not exactly a warm welcome, but it was not a dismissal either, and Jasper accepted it for what it was. He watered Copperhead and settled him in the corral with her 2 horses, a bay mare and a stocky gray gelding, who regarded the newcomer with mild curiosity. Then he went back to the yard and found that Clara had set the shotgun against the porch railing and was standing in the kitchen doorway. "I have supper on the fire," she said. "It's beans and cornbread, and there's enough for 2 if you've got better manners than some of the trail men I've encountered." "I have reasonable manners," he said. "We'll see," said Clara, and went inside. He sat at a plain wooden table in a kitchen that was scrupulously clean and organized with the efficiency of someone who had learned to do everything herself. The walls were limestone, cool even in summer, and the window above the table let in the last of the evening light. There were herbs hanging from the rafters to dry, and a shelf of preserves lined up in neat jars, and on a small side table near the window there was a book, a well-worn copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, with a piece of ribbon marking the reader's place about 2/3 of the way through. Jasper noticed the book and then noticed the ribbon marking the place, and thought that a woman who had gotten 2/3 through Middlemarch alone on a frontier homestead was a certain kind of person, and he thought he liked that kind very much. Clara put the food on the table and sat across from him, and they ate, and at first neither of them said much, because the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people taking the measure of each other with attention and care. She asked him where he was from originally, and he told her Kansas, a small farm town that no longer existed because it had dried up and blown away in a bad summer when he was 16, and his family had scattered, and he had gone to work on the range because it was the thing he knew how to do. He asked her where she was from, and she told him Missouri, where her family had a farm and where she had married Edward Sawyer at the age of 21, and followed him west to Texas, when he was convinced that the land out here held a future for them. And it had held a future, just not the one either of them had imagined, because Edward had been dead 2 years now, taken by typhoid fever in the summer of 1872, and Clara had decided to stay on the homestead because she had already broken the land and put in the garden and built up the flock, and she was not going to walk away from 2 years of her own work just because things had gotten harder. She said all of this plainly, without self-pity, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting facts they have long since made their peace with. Jasper listened carefully and did not offer condolences in the hollow way that people sometimes did, which he thought she probably appreciated. After supper she made coffee, real coffee, which tasted remarkable after weeks of the trail variety, and they sat on the porch in the last of the evening light, while the fireflies came up in the grass by the creek, and the sky darkened slowly through every shade of blue until it reached the deep true black of a clear country night full of stars. "You're not what I expected," Clara said at some point when the night had fully arrived. "What did you expect? A troublemaker mostly. Men who come uninvited to a woman's homestead are usually after something, land or other things." "I'm not after anything you don't choose to give," he said. "I mean that plainly and without conditions." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I believe you," she said finally. "I'm not sure why, but I do." "Mrs. Pemberton said you looked at people directly when you talked to them," he said. "I think that's why. You can tell." Clara glanced at him with a small expression of surprise. "She said that about me. She said it was rarer than it ought to be." Clara smiled then, for the first time a real smile, not the careful, guarded thing she had been allowing herself up to this point, and it changed her face entirely, opened it up like a window thrown wide to let in morning air, and Jasper felt his heart do something that he had not felt in a very long time. He slept that night in the barn, on a pile of clean straw that Clara indicated with a nod, and the information that there was a blanket on the peg near the door if he needed it. And he lay in the warm dark of the barn, listening to the horses breathe and the coyotes calling in the distance. And he stared up at the rough boards of the barn roof, and wondered what exactly was happening to him, and whether it was wonderful or completely foolish, and concluded that it was almost certainly both. He woke before dawn and went to the creek to wash, and came back and found Clara already in the kitchen, starting the fire for the morning meal, and he asked her if he could help, and she put him to work splitting wood because the pile beside the house was getting low, and he split wood for an hour in the early morning light while she cooked, and it was the most pleasant hour he had spent in a very long time. He ate breakfast at her table again, and then he helped her with the morning chores, feeding the chickens and the 2 milk goats she kept in a small pen beside the barn, and carrying water from the creek to the kitchen garden, because the windmill fed the stock trough, but not the garden, and they worked side by side without a great deal of conversation, but with a comfort and ease between them that felt remarkable given that they had known each other less than a day. At mid-morning, when the chores were done, Clara came and sat on the fence beside the corral and looked at Copperhead grazing with her horses, and she said, "How long were you planning to stay?" "I don't have an exact plan," he said. "I'm not on a drive at the moment. My last drive ended 3 weeks ago and the next one doesn't go out until the fall. I've been drifting some." "Drifting," she said with a thoughtful inflection that was not quite criticism but was not criticism either. "I know how that sounds," he said. "It sounds lonely," she said, and she said it without any sharpness at all, just observation, the way she said most things. "It is," he said. "It has been." She was quiet for a moment, watching the horses. Then she said, "I have a fence line on the north pasture that I've been meaning to repair for 2 months, and I haven't had time for it. If you're going to be here anyway, I could use the help." He looked at her. "You're offering me work." "I'm offering you something useful to do with your time," she said. "I'm not obligated to feed you through the week if you're just standing around looking at the sky." He laughed at that, a real laugh that surprised him with its own ease, and Clara looked at him with a slight widening of her eyes as though his laughter had surprised her too. "All right," he said. "I'll fix your fence." He fixed the fence. It took 3 days, because the north pasture was a good distance from the house, and the damage was more extensive than Clara had let on. And while he worked at it, he found himself doing the task with a kind of care and thoroughness that was more about the woman who owned the land than any professional instinct. He replaced rotten posts and tightened wire and checked every rail, and came back each evening tired and pleased with the work in a way that trail driving, despite its satisfactions, had never quite produced in him, and he understood dimly that the difference was about belonging somewhere, which was a thing he had not felt in a very long time. Each evening he and Clara sat on the porch after supper and talked. They talked about everything and nothing, in the easy, unguarded way that sometimes develops between people who have both spent time alone and have long passed the point of performing for company. She told him about her family in Missouri, her parents and her 2 older brothers who had stayed on the family land. He told her about the cattle drives, about the particular quality of light on the Texas plains at dusk, about the stars as seen from a bedroll in open country. She told him about the homestead, about the 2 years of solitary work and small victories, and the moments of near despair that she had gotten through by doing the next thing, and then the next thing after that. He told her about the loneliness of the trail life, and the way he had been aware for some time that he was moving through his life without being truly present in it, going from drive to drive with nothing fixed, nothing rooted. On the third night, when the fence was done and the stars were out and the air had cooled to the kind of pleasant temperature that the Texas hill country could produce on a summer evening, Clara said, "I went into Millhaven to order that dress because I realized I had spent 2 years believing that anything lovely was something I didn't deserve yet, that I had to earn back the right to want something for myself." Jasper was very still beside her. "I ordered it and I rode home and I felt better," she said, "like I had made some kind of decision about what kind of life I was going to let myself have." "What kind of life is that?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. Then she turned and looked at him directly, in that way she had, and said, "One with something in it besides work." The words landed in the quiet between them like a stone into still water, and the ripples moved outward through the warm night air, and Jasper looked back at her in the starlight and felt something in him settle, the way a compass needle settles when it finds true north, not a dramatic movement but a calm, certain, irreversible one. "I think," he said carefully, "that would be a very fine kind of life." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked back up at the stars, and she was smiling, and neither of them said anything else for a while, but the silence had a different quality than it had before, fuller, somehow, and warmer. He did not leave the next morning. There was no discussion about it, no negotiation. Clara simply asked him at breakfast whether he had looked at the kitchen garden fence the way she had mentioned, and he said he had not, and she said she supposed he had better, and that was that. The kitchen garden fence took 2 days, and by the time it was done, Jasper Thatcher had been on Clara Sawyer's homestead for nearly a week, and neither of them was pretending any more that it was only about fences. On the 7th day, Clara went into Millhaven to pick up the blue dress. She had not asked Jasper to come, but when she brought her mare around to the front of the house, she found him already saddled on Copperhead, and she looked at him for a moment with an expression that was carefully neutral except for the small light in those green eyes. "I thought you might want company on the ride," he said. 12 miles is not a great distance," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's nicer with someone to talk to." Clara regarded him for a beat. Then she clicked her tongue to her mare and set off down the lane, and he fell in beside her, and they rode to Millhaven together in the morning light, through the pale grass and the sage and the live oak trees, talking easily about everything they passed. Mrs. Pemberton's face when they came through her door together was a small masterpiece of composed surprise. She had clearly not anticipated that her careful description would produce such immediate and concrete results, and she looked from Clara to Jasper and back again, with the bright, careful eyes of a woman doing rapid internal calculations. "Well," she said simply. "Hello, Mrs. Pemberton," Clara said. "I've come for the dress." "So I see," Mrs. Pemberton said. "And you've brought Jasper Thatcher," Clara said. "He mentioned to me that you two have spoken." "We have," Mrs. Pemberton said, looking at Jasper with a slight lift of one eyebrow that communicated several things at once, including something that might have been approval. She went to the back of the shop and brought out the blue dress, carefully wrapped in a length of muslin, and laid it on the counter. Clara unwrapped it with a care that was almost reverent, and when the dress was fully uncovered in the light of the shop window, she stood and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Jasper stood to one side and watched her look at it, and thought that Mrs. Pemberton had been entirely right. The color was made for her, as though the particular blue of that fabric had always been waiting for the particular quality of her presence to give it its full meaning. "It's exactly right," Clara said softly. "It is," Mrs. Pemberton agreed, with quiet professional satisfaction. Then she glanced at Jasper and said, with the serene composure of a woman who knows perfectly well what she is doing, "I hope it was worth the ride, Mr. Thatcher." Clara looked at him then, and he looked at her, and the color in her cheeks deepened slightly, and she rewrapped the dress with great deliberateness, and paid Mrs. Pemberton the remaining balance without another word on the subject, though the corner of her mouth was doing something that suggested she was suppressing a smile. They rode back to the homestead in the full noon heat with the dress wrapped and packed carefully in Clara's saddlebag, and somewhere along the way, without any particular decision being made about it, their horses drifted closer together on the trail until they were riding side by side with barely a foot of space between them. "She's a matchmaker, that woman," Clara said, after they had been riding in comfortable silence for some time. "I think she's an observer," Jasper said. "She saw something in you when you came in to order that dress, something she thought was worth describing to the right person." Clara considered this. "And you think you're the right person?" Jasper looked at her steadily. "I think I'd like to be," he said, "if you'll allow it." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking ahead at the trail. The wind came through the grass and moved her hair slightly at the sides of her face where it had come loose from the pins. "I've been alone for 2 years," she said. "And before that I was with a man for 3 years who was good and kind, and I loved him, and he died, and that was the hardest thing I have ever experienced. I am not careless about what I let into my life." "I wouldn't want you to be," Jasper said. "I don't know you," she said. "Not really, not yet." "No," he agreed, "but we could fix that." "You'd have to stay," she said. There was something in her voice that was both matter-of-fact and very quiet, simultaneously practical and exposed, the way a person sounds when they are saying something they mean and are aware of the risk of meaning it. "I know," he said. "You're a trail man. You said yourself you've been moving for 8 years. "I have," he said. "And I'll tell you honestly that I can't say with certainty that a man who has been moving for 8 years makes a reliable fixture anywhere. But I can tell you that I have not felt about any place the way I feel about your porch at sundown. And I have not felt about any person the way I feel about sitting across a table from you. And I think those feelings are worth something. I think they're worth trying." The homestead came into view ahead of them, the stone house and the barn and the windmill and the kitchen garden with its new fence posts bright in the midday sun. Clara looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at Jasper, and something in her expression opened in a way that was very like the way she had smiled on the first night, wide and unguarded and entirely real. "I suppose we'll see," she said. Which, from Clara Sawyer, Jasper was learning, was very close to yes. The summer deepened around them as July moved into August. Jasper wrote a letter to the outfit he had been riding with, telling the foreman he would not be on the fall drive, which was the first time in 4 years he had declined a drive. He was not entirely sure what this meant about his future, but he found that he was not as frightened of the uncertainty as he would have expected to be. There was too much work on the homestead to spend time being frightened. He fixed the water trough that had been leaking since spring. He replaced the rotten section of the barn roof. He helped Clara put up hay for the winter from the north meadow, working alongside her for 2 long days of hard labor in the August heat, and they fell into the rhythm of it with a naturalness that felt ancient and right, the way people who have worked hard land together for a long time move around each other without collision. In the evenings they read, Clara working through Middlemarch at last, and occasionally reading passages aloud to him that she particularly liked. Jasper with a copy of the previous month's Texas State Gazette that he had picked up at the general store in Millhaven, which he read thoroughly before using it to start fires. They talked about what they read. Clara had opinions, clear and thoughtful and sometimes surprising, and she expressed them without hedging or asking permission, which he found he admired enormously. He had his own opinions and he expressed them too, and sometimes they disagreed, and the disagreements were interesting rather than damaging because both of them were used to thinking for themselves and respected the same quality in the other. One evening at the end of August, Clara put on the blue dress. She had not worn it yet. It had hung on the peg inside her bedroom door since she had brought it home, and occasionally he had noticed it there through the open door with that same impossible luminous quality it had carried in Mrs. Pemberton's window. She wore it that evening without announcing it, simply coming out of the house onto the porch where Jasper was sitting in the last of the light, and he looked up when he heard the door and stood without thinking, because it was a reflex produced by the sight of her. She stood on the porch in the blue dress in the evening light, and she looked at him with that direct, unguarded gaze, and she said, "Well, what do you think?" He thought many things. He thought that Mrs. Pemberton was a remarkably perceptive woman who had understood something about the essential nature of this person before she and Jasper had ever spoken. He thought that the dress was extraordinary and that the woman in it was more so. He thought that he had ridden 12 miles on a feeling and that the feeling had been the truest and best-aimed instinct he had ever followed in his life. "I think," he said carefully, "that you were right to order it." Clara tilted her head slightly. "That's a safe thing to say." "All right," he said. "I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and I think I am not going to stop feeling that way, and I think you should know it." The evening light was gold and rose, and the wind moved through the grass, and somewhere by the creek a mockingbird was running through its repertoire. And Clara Sawyer stood on her porch in a blue dress and looked at Jasper Thatcher with the clear, direct green eyes that Mrs. Pemberton had described so precisely. And after a moment she walked to where he was standing and she put her hand against his face, very gently, in a gesture that was both question and answer at once. He covered her hand with his. They stayed like that for a moment in the warm evening, and then she leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And they stood on the porch while the light faded, and the stars came out one by one over the Texas hill country. And neither of them felt the need to say anything else because some things are better communicated without words. September arrived, and with it the first suggestion of autumn in the evenings, a coolness in the air after sunset that made the stars look sharper and cleaner, and the fire inside the house seemed more necessary and welcome. Jasper had by this point become a settled presence on the homestead, and the land itself seemed to have accepted him, the way land sometimes accepts a person who works it honestly and pays attention to what it needs. He had gone back into Millhaven twice since he had settled on the homestead, once for supplies and once to speak with Mr. Holt about a matter of some legal delicacy. Millhaven had a land office, and Jasper had learned from Mr. Holt that there was a piece of land adjacent to Clara's claim, a section of about 300 acres that ran along the eastern boundary of her property, and had been unoccupied since its original claimant had abandoned it 2 years previous and ridden east. The land was available for filing under the Homestead Act of 1862, which allowed a citizen to claim up to 160 acres of unoccupied public land by filing a claim and improving it over 5 years, though the specifics of available land in Texas were somewhat more complicated due to the state's unique land policy. Jasper had spent a serious hour with the land agent at the county office, a thin, precise man named Mr. Graves, who had laid out the particulars carefully and told Jasper that the adjacent section was in fact available under the appropriate state filing. He had not told Clara about this yet. He was thinking about how to do it without presumption, because he was aware that what he was considering was large and that it required her agreement, not merely her tolerance. He told her on a Sunday morning in the second week of September, while they were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the remains of breakfast between them and the morning light coming in through the window. "I went to the land office in Millhaven," he said. "There is a 300-acre section adjacent to your east pasture that's available for filing. I looked at the boundary yesterday from the ridge and it runs all the way to the creek bend." Clara put her coffee cup down carefully. She was looking at him. "I spoke with Mr. Graves about the filing process," he said. "It's complicated, but it's possible. The land is good grazing country, and with your north pasture and that section combined, you'd have enough ground to run a proper cattle operation rather than just keeping a few animals. You could do something real here." "Jasper," she said. "I know it's presumptuous," he said. "I know that. I'm not trying to put myself into something that isn't mine. I've been thinking about the land and what it could be and about staying. About whether you'd want me to stay in a permanent way, because I would if you'd have me. But I wanted to say it plainly before I did anything formal, because it's your land and your life and the decision belongs to you." Clara was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her coffee cup, and then out the window, and then back at him. "You went to the land office," she said slowly, "to find out how to file a claim on land next to mine." "Yes. So that you could build something here, next to me." "Yes. And you are telling me this before you did anything about it because you wanted to know what I thought." "Yes." She was quiet again. The morning light moved across the table between them. "Edward used to make decisions," she said at last, "and tell me about them afterward. Not from malice, he was not a bad man. He just believed he knew best, and that telling me was a formality. It drove me absolutely mad." Jasper said nothing. "You came to me first," she said. "Of course," he said, as though it had never occurred to him to do otherwise. Clara looked at him for a long time with that careful, direct attention of hers, reading something in him that he hoped was true and good and worth reading. Then she said, "File the claim." He looked at her. "File the claim," she said again, and she picked up her coffee and drank it with the composure of a woman who has made a decision and is at peace with it, and she was smiling into the cup. Jasper filed the claim the following Thursday. He rode into Millhaven, completed the necessary documents at the county land office under the watchful supervision of Mr. Graves, and paid the filing fee from the money he had saved over 4 years of trail driving and carefully not spent. He stopped in to see Mrs. Pemberton on his way back through, because it seemed right. She was at her sewing machine as she had been the first time he had come through her door, and she looked up at him over her spectacles and said nothing, simply waited. "I wanted you to know that it worked out," he said. "Your description." Mrs. Pemberton's face did something complicated and warm. "She's good people," she said. "The best I've ever known," he said. Mrs. Pemberton nodded once and turned back to her sewing, which was clearly her way of indicating that the matter was settled, and she was satisfied with the outcome. Jasper put his hat back on and went out into the September sunlight and rode home. He was beginning to think of it as home. That was new. That was something. The fall moved through its stages with the stateliness that the Texas hill country afforded to the season, the cooling of the air, and the reddening of the sumac along the creek, and the slow, steady work of preparation for winter. Jasper and Clara spent the long days of October laying up provisions, and making repairs, and bringing in the last of the kitchen garden before the first frost, and checking every structural element of the house and barn for anything that might need attention before the cold came. They worked with an ease and mutual understanding that had developed so naturally over the months that it felt as though it had always been there, as though the two of them had always been this. Two people working a piece of land together at the edge of a creek in the hill country of Texas. One evening in late October, when the first frost had come and gone and the air was sharp and clear, and the fire in the kitchen hearth was burning well, they were sitting at the table after supper with the lamp between them, and Jasper was looking at Clara across the yellow light, with a feeling in him that was so full it was almost uncomfortable in the most wonderful way. "I want to ask you something," he said. Clara set down the letter she had been reading from her mother in Missouri and looked at him. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me. I want to live on this land with you and work it with you and grow old here with you, and I want that more than I have ever wanted any specific thing in my life. But I'll say again, as I said about the land, the decision belongs to you." Clara looked at him across the lamp. She was quiet, but it was not the quiet of someone who did not know what she thought. It was the quiet of someone who knew exactly what she thought and was deciding how to say it. "2 years ago," she said, "when Edward died, I thought the future was just work, just endurance, just getting through. I couldn't imagine anything beyond that, beyond the next season, the next fence, the next thing that needed doing. And I didn't mind that, not really. I'm not afraid of work or of being alone. But it was smaller than I would have chosen." "Yes," he said. "And then I decided to order a dress," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "Just because I wanted something beautiful, and a stranger rode 12 miles because of it, and everything changed." "Everything changed," he agreed. "Yes," Clara said simply, "I'll marry you." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and she let him hold them, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a long time, in the warm kitchen of her stone house, with the fire going and the wind outside and the whole of the dark, clear Texas night above them. They were married in Millhaven at the end of November, 1874. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, a traveling Methodist minister named Reverend Aldous Cole, who came through Millhaven every 6 weeks on his circuit and performed baptisms, weddings, and funerals with equal and dignified competence. It was a quiet affair, as befitted two people who were practical about most things, held in the small Millhaven Community Hall with perhaps 20 people in attendance. Mr. and Mrs. Holt from the store, the Crandall family from the neighboring homestead 5 miles to the west, a few other settlers from the surrounding country, and Mrs. Pemberton, who sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and an expression of serene satisfaction that suggested she regarded the whole event as a direct and entirely expected consequence of her own good judgment. Clara wore the blue dress. She had said simply, when the subject had come up, that she had not bought it for any occasion, and that this seemed like an occasion worth having, and she appeared in it with her hair put up with a few small white flowers woven into it that she had somehow found even in November. And when Jasper saw her come through the door of the community hall, he understood, in a full and final way, exactly what Mrs. Pemberton had known when she looked at this woman 3 months ago, and decided she was worth describing in careful detail to a stranger. He stood at the front of the room and watched Clara walk toward him, and thought that the whole long, lonely road of his life, all the drives and the open sky, and the years of moving without roots, had been building toward this exact moment. This woman in this blue dress walking toward him in a small room in a small town in Texas, with the November light coming in through the windows and the Reverend Cole waiting with his book, and the whole future opening up like the wide country outside. He said his vows with a steadiness and a certainty that he felt in every part of himself, and Clara said hers in her clear, direct voice, looking at him with those green eyes. And when Reverend Cole said they were married, Jasper took her face in his hands and kissed her, and the small room full of their neighbors made an appreciative sound that he barely heard. Mrs. Pemberton, leaving the hall afterward, paused beside Jasper and said only, "Well done, Mr. Thatcher," and went out into the November air with her coat buttoned neatly and her step light. The winter was a good one, as Texas winters went, cold enough to remind you of its nature but not brutal, with enough firewood stacked against the house and enough provisions in the root cellar and enough warmth in the stone house to make the nights comfortable and the evenings long and pleasant. They read by the fire and talked and played cards, and Clara taught Jasper to play chess on a board she had made herself from a piece of flat wood with the squares painted on, using pieces she had carved from small blocks of cottonwood over 2 winters of patient evenings' work. And he was a poor student at first, but an increasingly dangerous one. They talked about the land and what they wanted to do with it. Jasper's claim to the east section was proceeding properly, the improvement requirements of the claim being addressed by his presence and the work he had put in. And in the spring, they planned to put up a fence along the eastern boundary and begin running more cattle on the combined acreage. They discussed breeds and prices and the state of the beef market, which Clara knew better than Jasper had expected, because she had been managing a small cattle operation alone for 2 years and had educated herself in the business with her characteristic thoroughness. In the spring of 1875, Jasper rode a cattle-buying trip north to the stock pens at San Antonio, where he spent a week attending the sales and came back with 12 young heifers and 2 bulls of good quality that he had selected with care, and the combined operation of the Thatcher homestead began in earnest. It was hard work and satisfying work, and they did it together. And by the fall of that year the herd was establishing itself, and the books, kept in Clara's precise handwriting in a leather-bound ledger, showed numbers that were not yet prosperous but were unmistakably solvent and moving in the right direction. It was in the fall of 1875 that Clara told him she was expecting their first child. She told him at the breakfast table with her customary directness, looking at him across the morning coffee, and he sat very still for a moment, and then he set his cup down and came around the table and put his arms around her and held her in a way that said everything. He was feeling better than any words he could have found. "How are you feeling?" was what he said when he could say anything. "Well," she said, "a little tired in the mornings, otherwise well." "Are you frightened?" "A little," she said honestly. "It's significant." "It is," he agreed. "I'm here, whatever you need." She patted his hand where it rested on her shoulder. "I know," she said. "That's rather the point of all this." Their son was born in the spring of 1876, on a clear April morning when the live oaks along the creek were putting out new leaves, and the wildflowers were coming up in the pasture in thick drifts of color. The midwife from Millhaven, a capable and unflappable woman named Mrs. Garza, who had delivered a significant portion of the county's population, presided over the birth with quiet efficiency. And by mid-morning, Clara had delivered a healthy boy with a full head of dark hair, and the serious, attentive expression of someone who has arrived somewhere important and is taking careful stock of the situation. They named him Thomas, after Clara's father, and Thomas Edward, for the man who had broken this land first and whose efforts had made it possible for them to be here at all. Clara had suggested both names herself, and Jasper had agreed immediately, because it seemed right and good to carry those things forward. Jasper held his son for the first time in the afternoon, sitting on the edge of the bed in the dim room while Clara rested, with Thomas wrapped in a length of good cotton cloth and making small, intense faces at the ceiling. He sat there with this new and extraordinary weight in his arms and thought about the series of events that had produced this moment. A dress in a window, a woman's name on a dressmaker's tongue, 12 miles of Texas road under a summer sky, and years of patient, growing, real love. He thought about the blue dress, hanging now on the peg inside their bedroom door, carefully preserved, worn only for the most particular occasions. He thought about Mrs. Pemberton, who was almost certainly going to be insufferably satisfied with herself when she heard about this, and who had earned every bit of that satisfaction. He thought about Clara, lying in the next room, who had done the hardest work of all and who he loved with a depth and steadiness that surprised him still with its own completeness. Thomas opened his eyes, dark and unfocused, and looked in the general direction of his father's face, and Jasper said, very quietly so as not to wake Clara, "Hello, I am very glad you're here." Thomas made a small, complicated sound and went back to the serious business of being a new person. The years on the Thatcher homestead moved forward with the rhythm and purpose of a life being built deliberately and with care. The cattle operation grew steadily as Jasper's knowledge of the trail markets combined with Clara's methodical management of the books and the land. By 1877, they had expanded the herd to 40 head, and by 1878, they were running 60, which was enough to turn a real profit at the fall markets and to begin making genuine improvements to the property. They built a new barn in the spring of 1878, larger than the old one, with a proper loft and good ventilation, and they hired 2 young hands from Millhaven to help with the cattle work, brothers named Abel and Marcus Rays, who were 17 and 19 respectively, and who proved to be hardworking, reliable, and possessed of a cheerful disposition that made the long days of cattle work more pleasant. Jasper paid them fairly and without quibbling, and taught them everything he knew about cattle, which was considerable, and treated them with the same straightforward respect he gave to everyone who worked honestly. Clara learned to ride the entire perimeter of their combined acreage once a week, and could identify a fence problem or a sick animal from a considerable distance. And she had opinions about the herd's management that were sharp and specific, and usually right. She also kept up her reading with a consistency that impressed him, ordering books from a bookseller in San Antonio when they could afford to. And on winter evenings, the table was always covered with books and papers, and the lamp burning low while they talked about whatever they had been reading. And sometimes these conversations ran until midnight with neither of them noticing the hour. Thomas grew into a serious, curious boy who asked questions about everything and followed his father around the property with the intensity of a small scientist studying field conditions. He had Clara's green eyes and Jasper's dark hair, and a combination of both their temperaments, his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, that produced a child who was simultaneously very easy to reason with and absolutely impossible to distract from a question he had decided to pursue. In the spring of 1879, Clara told Jasper she was expecting again. This time she was calmer about it, or perhaps more accurately had the calm of someone who has done this before and knows the shape of the thing. The pregnancy was easier than the first, which she attributed to having fewer things to prove to herself, and the birth, managed again by Mrs. Garza with quiet competence, produced in October of that year a daughter, a small, round-faced girl with Clara's brown hair, and a pair of lungs that announced her arrival with a conviction that was audible across the yard. They named her Margaret Jane. Margaret for Jasper's mother, whom he had not seen since he was 16 and thought of still with a mix of love and sorrow. Jane for Mrs. Pemberton, whose full first name was Jane Margaret, which produced, when they told her, an expression on the dressmaker's face that was the most openly moved Jasper had ever seen it. Mrs. Pemberton had by this point become a fixed and valued presence in their lives, a woman they saw regularly in Millhaven, and who appeared at the homestead from time to time for Sunday dinners, riding out herself on a reliable old bay horse with the assurance of a woman who had been riding the Texas hill country for 30 years and did not need assistance. She and Clara had developed a friendship that Jasper thought was one of the great things he had been given as an indirect consequence of following his instinct that summer afternoon in 1874. Two women with very different lives who recognized in each other something essential and true and worth knowing. The homestead at Archer's Fork continued to grow and improve through the late 1870s and into the new decade. By 1880, the house had been expanded. Jasper and two hired helpers from town had added 2 rooms to the north side, a proper bedroom for Thomas and a second room that served as a kind of study for Clara, where she kept her books and her ledgers and could sit and think and work without the interruptions of the main room. It was the room she loved most in the house, Jasper thought, and he had built it for her with that in mind, making the window large so the north light came in cleanly, and putting up good wooden shelves on 3 walls that she immediately filled with an organized efficiency that was entirely characteristic. Thomas started his formal schooling in 1881, riding into Millhaven 4 days a week to attend the small school that the town had established 2 years prior with a teacher imported from Austin. The teacher was a young woman named Miss Eleanor Ward, who was 23 years old and very well educated and slightly alarmed by the frontier, in a way she was bravely trying to overcome. And Thomas, who could already read better than most of his classmates because Clara had been teaching him at home since he was 4, was one of her favorite students, which Thomas accepted with the modesty of someone who finds academic achievement simply normal. Margaret, who was 2 when Thomas started school, spent her days attached variously to her mother, her father, and Abel and Marcus Rays, whom she had apparently appointed as additional members of her family without consulting them, and who had accepted this role with a good-natured resignation that suggested they did not entirely mind. One afternoon in October of 1881, when the air was cool and the pecan trees along the creek were heavy with nuts, and the sky was that deep clear blue that only comes in the Texas fall, Jasper went looking for Clara and found her in her study, sitting at her writing table with a letter in her hand and her face very still in a way that told him something significant had happened. "My father died," she said before he could ask. "Last month. My mother writes that it was his heart." It was quick. He went to her immediately and crouched beside her chair and took the hand that was not holding the letter, and she leaned her head against his, and they were quiet together for a while. "He was a good man," she said finally. "He always thought I was too stubborn." "He was right," Jasper said gently. A small sound escaped her that was almost a laugh. He was always right about me. He wanted me to come home after Edward died. He thought Texas was too hard, too far." "Do you wish you had?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I would have lost all of this. I would have lost you." She paused. "But I wish I had gone to see him more. I should have found the money and the time." "You can go see your mother," he said. "We can manage the spring work. You could take the children and be gone for 6 weeks. She'd want to see the grandchildren." Clara looked at him with an expression that was part gratitude and part something else, something that was the quality of being loved correctly, being known and considered by someone who pays genuine attention. "6 weeks is a long time," she said. "The ranch won't fall apart in 6 weeks," he said. "Abel and Marcus are perfectly capable. I'll be here." "You won't come." "I'll come if you want me to. But I thought perhaps you might want time with your family that wasn't complicated by introducing a husband, just you and your mother and the children." Clara considered this for a long moment. "You're a perceptive man," she said. "I've been learning from you," he said. She went to Missouri in April of 1882, taking Thomas and Margaret on the long train journey that they had been able to afford since the railroad had reached closer to their part of Texas. And she was gone for 7 weeks, which was slightly longer than the 6 he had suggested. And every one of those days felt long to him, in a way that underlined with great clarity how completely his sense of what home meant had transformed in the years since he had arrived at this piece of land. He managed the cattle work with Abel and Marcus, and kept the house clean and fed the chickens and the goats and fixed 2 sections of fence that needed attention and wrote to Clara 3 times. Letters that he worked over with some care, because he was better at expressing himself in person than on paper. And she wrote back 4 times. Letters that were full of news about her family and her mother's health and Thomas's wonder at the train, and Margaret's immediate conquest of the Missouri relatives. And in each letter she also wrote a sentence or 2 that was quiet and direct and meant for him alone. And he read those sentences more times than the rest of the letters combined. When she came back in May, arriving in Millhaven on the afternoon train, he was standing on the platform with Copperhead's successor, a sturdy bay horse named Almanac, and the wagon he had hitched for the purpose. And when she came down from the train car with Thomas at her heels and Margaret in her arms, he crossed the platform and took Margaret from her without preamble and kissed Clara in the middle of the public platform in Millhaven with a completeness of feeling that made Thomas cover his eyes and Margaret make an enthusiastic noise of approval. "I missed you," he said against her hair. "I know," she said. "I missed you terribly." "Good," he said. "Come home." They drove back to the homestead in the spring evening with the children asleep in the back of the wagon, and the last light going gold across the grass and the creek glittering through the trees. And when the house came into view, Clara made a small sound that was not quite a word but was entirely clear in its meaning. "This is mine, and I love it, and I am glad to be back." Jasper reached over and took her hand on the wagon seat, and she let him hold it all the way home. The years continued to pass, and with each year the Thatcher homestead became more of what Jasper had imagined in those early conversations when they had sat on the porch in the summer dark and talked about what the land could be. By 1883, they were running close to 100 head on the combined acreage, which was a proper operation by any reasonable measure of the term, and the ledger that Clara kept was thoroughly and satisfyingly in the black. They were not wealthy in any grand sense of the word, but they were stable and solvent and improving, which in the hill country of Texas in the 1880s was a considerable achievement. Thomas, at 8 years old, was both a diligent student and an increasingly useful presence on the ranch, with a natural aptitude for understanding animals that went beyond what he had been explicitly taught. He had a particular gift with horses, a quiet, patient manner around them that the animals seemed to respond to. And Jasper thought sometimes that by the time Thomas was a man, he would know more about horses than Jasper himself, which was both a little humbling and deeply pleasing. Margaret at 4 was a different kind of person entirely. Where Thomas was serious and methodical, Margaret was joyful and impulsive and in perpetual motion, and she ran at the world with an enthusiastic determination that exhausted everyone around her and seemed to cost herself no energy at all. She had, Clara said occasionally, Jasper's stubbornness combined with her own independent streak, which was either a marvel of heredity or God's idea of a joke. In November of 1883, on a cool, clear afternoon when the geese were moving south over the property in long formations that made sound like the turning of the sky itself, Clara came and found Jasper in the barn, where he was working on a bridle that had needed repair for a month. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up from the bridle and read her face and felt something warm and certain start in the center of his chest. "We're expecting again," she said, and she was smiling in the way she had when she was trying not to show how pleased she was, which had the effect of making it entirely clear how pleased she was. He set down the bridle and crossed the barn and took her hands and stood looking at her in the dim barn light with the sound of the geese passing over outside, and he said, "That is the best thing I've heard all week." "You're easy to please," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I am, particularly where you're concerned." She shook her head at him in the way she did when she was amused and not going to admit it, and he kissed her right there in the barn with the horses watching benignly, and she laughed against his mouth, and the sound of it moved through him like light through water. Their third child, a second son, was born in July of 1884, in the height of a Texas summer, and they named him William. William Joseph Thatcher, the Joseph for an uncle of Jasper's who had been the closest thing he had to a father figure in his young life, a man who had worked cattle all his days and taught Jasper the essential skills and ethics of the trade before he died of a bad fall from a horse in 1869. William arrived in the world with an energy and a volume that immediately established him as a distinct personality, and he lived up to this initial impression by being, as Clara observed when he was about 6 months old, the sort of person who requires watching at all times. He was simultaneously the most demanding and the most charming of their children, with a combination of absolute determination and a laugh that could dissolve any reasonable amount of parental frustration, and the household rearranged itself around him with the adaptive efficiency of a family that has experience. By the mid-1880s, Millhaven itself had grown considerably. The railroad's expansion through central Texas had brought new settlers and new commerce, and the small town that had been a scattering of buildings around a single main road was beginning to develop the bones of something more substantial. There was a proper hotel now, and a second saloon and a bank, and a doctor's office staffed by a physician from San Antonio who came through twice a month, and who the community was working to persuade to relocate permanently. The school had expanded to accommodate more students, and Miss Eleanor Ward, who had long since overcome her initial alarm at frontier life, was now Mrs. Eleanor Brewster, wife of the local blacksmith, and was still teaching with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. Mrs. Pemberton's shop had become one of the anchor businesses of the town, with a reputation that extended well beyond Millhaven to the surrounding communities. She had trained a young apprentice, a quick and talented girl from a neighboring settlement, and the shop now produced twice the work it had when she had been working alone. She remained Mrs. Pemberton. She had been widowed young, before Jasper had ever come to Millhaven, and had kept the name but not pursued any replacement of the arrangement, having opinions about independence that she held quietly but firmly, and she remained one of the fixed points of the Thatcher family's life in the community. One morning in the spring of 1886, Jasper rode into Millhaven to arrange the registration of the spring calf crop, and stopped in to see Mrs. Pemberton, as he usually did when he was in town. He found her at her cutting table, and she looked up at him over her spectacles with the expression that was her version of warmth, which was quiet and genuine and entirely without performance. "You look well," she said. "I am well," he said. He settled into the chair that she had at the side of the shop for customers who came to consult about orders, and he looked around the shop at the bolts of fabric and the fashion plates and the dressmaker's form in the corner, and he thought of the first time he had stood in this doorway with his hat in his hands, dusty from the trail, asking questions he could not entirely explain. "I never properly thanked you," he said, "for what you told me that day about Clara." Mrs. Pemberton glanced up from her cutting and gave him a look that was somewhere between dismissive and pleased. "I told a stranger about a customer," she said, "that's all." "You told the right stranger about the right customer," he said, "and you told it in exactly the right way. You told me who she was, not just what she looked like. You described her character. That's what made me ride out there." "I know," Mrs. Pemberton said simply, with the composure of a woman who is not surprised to have this confirmed. "That's why I told it that way." Jasper looked at her for a moment. "You knew what you were doing." "I thought I might," she said. "She needed someone who would come for the right reasons. I thought perhaps you were someone who would understand the difference." "I would have ridden out there regardless," he said, "but I would have gone as a man chasing a pretty face in a description. You made me go as a man chasing a person. That's different." Mrs. Pemberton set down her cutting tool and looked at him directly. "Is she happy?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Very. And so am I, more than I knew was possible, frankly." Mrs. Pemberton nodded once and picked up her cutting tool again. "Then we are both satisfied with the outcome," she said, and returned to her work. Jasper rode home in the spring sunshine along the road that he had now traveled hundreds of times, past Archer's Fork, and through the gate and up the lane to the house, and he could see from a long way off that Clara was in the kitchen garden with Margaret, who was running between the rows with her apron full of something she had collected, and William, who at nearly 2 was attempting to follow Margaret with his shorter legs and his enormous determination. And somewhere in the barn Thomas was likely doing something careful and focused with one of the horses. He stopped Almanac at the gate and sat for a moment looking at all of it, the stone house and the good barn, and the fields with the cattle moving in the middle distance, and the windmill turning in the spring breeze, and the kitchen garden, and the 2 small figures in it, and the creek glittering through the trees beyond. Clara looked up from the garden and saw him at the gate, and even at this distance he could see the quality of her attention, that direct, clear focus that had been one of the first things Mrs. Pemberton had described to him, and that 12 years of living with it had not made any less remarkable. She raised a hand in greeting, easy and unsentimental, the gesture of someone who is glad to see you without needing to perform the gladness. He raised his hand back and opened the gate and rode in. The years that followed brought their own seasons and their own changes, as years always do. Abel Reyes married a woman from a settlement 30 miles east and established his own small operation, though he still consulted with Jasper on cattle matters, and the connection between their families remained solid and genuine. Marcus Reyes stayed on as a full-time hand, and became so integral to the operation that Jasper eventually offered him a share in the future of the ranch, an arrangement that Marcus accepted with a quiet dignity that made Jasper glad he had done it. Thomas, by his early teens, was already indispensable to the cattle work, with his gift for horses developing exactly as Jasper had suspected it might, and he was additionally proving to be good at the business end of things, sitting in on conversations between his father and the cattle buyers at market with an attention that missed nothing. He was a fine young man, serious and steady and decent, and watching him grow into himself was one of the ongoing pleasures of Jasper's life. Margaret grew up with the determined independence of someone who had observed two thoroughly self-sufficient parents from birth, and considered this the natural order of things. She was bright and headstrong and funny, and she read voraciously, inheriting both her mother's book collection and her habit of staying up too late with a lamp and a page. And by the time she was 12, she had opinions about cattle management and weather patterns and the novels of Charles Dickens that were expressed with a conviction that made adults pay attention whether they intended to or not. William grew up to be exactly what his early personality had promised, full of energy and laughter. The person who could find something entertaining about any situation, and who managed to make hard work feel like an adventure, which was a quality that made him invaluable on a cattle ranch where hard work was the constant, and the adventure was often imaginary. In the spring of 1889, when Thomas was 13 and well into the serious work of becoming the man he was going to be, and Margaret was 9 and William 4, Clara came to Jasper in his study, the room beside hers, which he had set up with a small desk for the cattle records and accounts on a quiet evening after the children were in bed. She sat across from him with her hands folded on the table, and she looked at him with the steady directness that he had come to understand was her way of approaching anything important. 15 years, she said. He set down his pen. Since this spring, yes. 15 years since a stranger rode up to my gate and called out, "Hello, the house," she said. "And you came out with a shotgun," he said. "You were a stranger," she said. "I was sensible." "You were sensible," he agreed. "You were also terrifying." The corner of her mouth moved. "You didn't seem terrified." "I was," he said. "I was absolutely certain you were going to run me off, and I was trying to decide whether to argue or accept the outcome with dignity." Clara laughed, the full, open laugh that she gave to things that genuinely delighted her, the one that still surprised him every time with its warmth. "What made you think arguing would help?" "Nothing," he said. "I was going to accept the outcome with dignity." She shook her head at him, smiling, and he looked at her across the desk in the lamplight and thought, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, that the sum of 15 years of daily life with Clara Sawyer Thatcher was a thing of such richness and texture and depth that he could not begin to account for all of it or contain it in any form that would do it justice. It was in the way they had learned each other's moods and needs without having to ask. It was in the way they disagreed and worked it through and came out the other side. It was in the way she could say something with a glance that would have taken someone else 3 sentences, and the way he had learned to say the things out loud that she most needed to hear even when she would not ask for them. It was in the 3 children sleeping in the rooms down the hall, and in the land outside the window that they had built together from a claim and a dream and a great deal of difficult work. It was in 15 winters of the same fire and 15 springs of the same planting and 15 summers of the same long days and 15 autumns of the same harvest, and in all of those seasons learning every year that love at its best was not a fixed thing but a living one, growing and changing and deepening in ways that surprised you even when you were paying close attention. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked. "You," he said. "The whole of it. You and everything." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I ordered a dress." "You ordered a dress," he agreed, "and everything changed. Everything changed." She stood up from her chair and came around the desk, and he turned to face her, and she put her hands on his face the way she had done on the porch on that first evening, with that gesture that was both question and answer, and he covered her hands with his. "Thank you," she said, "for following your instinct. Thank you," he said, "for not turning me around at the gate." She leaned her forehead against his and closed her eyes, and the house was quiet around them, and the night was clear and full of stars outside the window, and the windmill turned in the evening breeze over Archer's Fork, and everything was entirely, completely, and without question exactly as it should be. In the summer of 1890, Mrs. Pemberton retired from her dressmaking shop in Millhaven. She was 70 years old by this time, and her hands had begun to trouble her in the way that hands will after a lifetime of precise and demanding work. and she passed the shop to her apprentice, who had by this time been with her for 8 years and was more than ready to take it on. The retirement was marked by a small gathering at the community hall. Millhaven had developed the habit of marking such occasions as the town had grown and Jasper, and Clara came in from the homestead with all 3 children and sat near the front and listened to the various people of the town speak about what Mrs. Pemberton's work and presence had meant to the community. When the formal part of the evening was over and people were standing around with cups of punch and plates of cake that had been brought in for the occasion, Jasper found himself standing beside Mrs. Pemberton near the window, as he had stood beside her in her shop so many times over the years. "Are you at peace with it?" he asked. "Retiring?" "Entirely," she said, with her characteristic composure. "I have done what I set out to do. The shop is in good hands and the work will continue. My own hands need to rest. What will you do with yourself?" She gave him a slightly amused look. "I expect I will find things to do." "I am not a person who has trouble filling time, Mr. Thatcher." "No," he agreed. "You are not." Clara appeared at his elbow then, bringing 2 cups of punch, and she handed one to Mrs. Pemberton and kept one for herself and stood between the 2 of them with the ease of someone who is entirely comfortable where she is. "We ought to tell her," Clara said to Jasper. Mrs. Pemberton looked between them. "Tell me what?" Clara and Jasper exchanged a glance that contained a great deal of private information, as the glances of people who have lived together for 15 years tend to do. "We are expecting another child," Clara said. "In the spring." Mrs. Pemberton was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Clara and she said very quietly, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," Clara said. "I am 40 years old and I intend to be sensible about it, but I am perfectly well." Mrs. Pemberton nodded slowly. Then she looked at Jasper and then back at Clara, and she put her cup down on the windowsill and she took both of Clara's hands in her own gently. "Good," she said. "That is good." The 4th child, a daughter they named Jane after Mrs. Pemberton, arrived in April of 1891, healthy and round, and possessed of her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, and a manner that combined the gravity of Thomas with the wit of Margaret in a way that nobody had predicted, but that seemed, in retrospect, entirely inevitable. Mrs. Pemberton was the first visitor from outside the family. Arriving 3 days after the birth with a small bundle of things, she had made a quilt and a dress. The dress in a pale green that was beautiful and clearly chosen with the same precision she had brought to every garment she had ever made. Clara held the dress up and looked at it and then at Mrs. Pemberton and said, "It's the right color." "It is," Mrs. Pemberton said simply, with her quiet professional certainty. "It will suit her very well." The years after Jane's birth were full in the way that a life being lived with purpose and love, and the ongoing work of a growing family and a serious cattle operation tends to be full. Thomas, as he moved through his teenage years and into young manhood, became increasingly central to the ranch's operation, with a competence and a steadiness that made it clear he was not simply following in his father's path, but was finding his own version of it, bringing his particular gifts to bear in ways that Jasper had not anticipated and that he admired greatly. By 1895, Thomas at 19 was effectively running the day-to-day cattle management alongside Marcus Ray's, and he had expanded the horse-training operation that had begun as a sideline into something that was bringing in significant revenue in its own right. He had a gift, and he knew how to use it, and watching him work was a pleasure that Jasper never tired of. Margaret, at 15, was the student that her mother had been voracious and precise and interested in everything, with a particular gift for mathematics that had led the current Millhaven schoolteacher to write to the Thatchers to suggest that she ought to be receiving a more advanced education than the local school could provide. Clara and Jasper had serious conversations about this, about the options and the costs and what Margaret herself wanted, which they asked her directly, as they had always asked their children what they wanted because they believed this to be both respectful and practical. Margaret said she wanted to go to school in Austin. She said it directly in her mother's way, looking at both of them with the clear calm of someone who has thought about something carefully and arrived at a conclusion, and is presenting it for discussion rather than requesting permission. They arranged it. It was a significant expense and a significant adjustment, and Margaret rode the train to Austin in the fall of 1895 to attend the school there. And she wrote home every week with letters that were full of information and opinion and occasional dry observation that made Clara laugh out loud reading them at the kitchen table. William, at 11, had become the person that the ranch could not have done without in ways that were difficult to enumerate but were entirely real. He was the person who noticed when an animal was off, who remembered which fence gate had been stiff last week, who could find a missing tool or a strayed calf with an intuitive sense of the land that came from a decade of running over every inch of it. He was also, by this age, fully aware of his own charm and deploying it with considerable effectiveness, which his parents observed with mixed feelings. And Jane was 4, and was already doing everything she could to keep up with the older 3, with a persistence and an energy that reminded Jasper very specifically of Clara on the homestead in the 2 years before he had arrived, working the land alone and refusing to give up. The quality was in the bones of the Sawyer women, and it expressed itself generation by generation in new forms, and it was one of the things he loved most about his family. On the evening of his and Clara's 20th anniversary, in November of 1894, Jasper rode into Millhaven in the afternoon and came back with a package wrapped in brown paper and string that he placed on the kitchen table when he came in and went to wash the trail dust off himself before supper. Clara, who was making the anniversary supper herself, roast chicken, which was a considerable luxury, but which she had been planning for 2 days with a methodical enthusiasm that made the children extremely curious, noticed the package, but did not open it until after they had eaten and the children had been put to bed, and the kitchen was clean, and the fire was going well. Jasper sat across the table from her and watched her open it. Inside the brown paper was a length of fabric, a deep, rich, saturated blue, nearly identical in shade to the fabric of the dress she had ordered 20 years ago, but newer and better quality, the best that could be obtained in 1894 from the shop that had been Mrs. Pemberton's and was now her apprentice's. Clara looked at it for a long time without speaking, her hands spread flat on the surface of the fabric. "The woman at the shop remembered your measurements," Jasper said. "She has Mrs. Pemberton's records. She said she could make it by spring if you wanted." Clara looked up at him and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was in that direction. "Blue again," she said. "Blue again," he agreed, "because it was right the first time." She came around the table then and she sat beside him and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together at the table in their kitchen in the stone house that they had built and rebuilt over 20 years, with the fire going and the children asleep down the hall and the November night outside full of cold, clear stars. And Clara put her hand over his and said, "I am so glad Mrs. Pemberton had eyes in her head." "So am I," he said, "every single day." She turned her face up to him, and he kissed her in the firelight, slow and certain, with 20 years of love in it and the full, clear knowledge that there would be 20 more, and 20 after that, as much as the earth and time would give them. The new blue dress was finished by March of 1895, delivered to the homestead by the dressmaker's apprentice herself, a young woman named Rosa who was making her first delivery to the Thatcher homestead, but had heard about its origins from Mrs. Pemberton often enough that she felt she understood something of what she was delivering. Clara tried it on in the bedroom and came out into the kitchen where Jasper was sitting with Jane on his knee reading aloud from a picture book, and he looked up from the book and stopped reading. Jane, who was almost 5 and extremely observant, looked at her mother in the blue dress and said, with the clear authority of someone making an official pronouncement, "You look beautiful, Mama." "Thank you, Jane," Clara said. Jane looked at her father. "Doesn't she?" Jasper looked at Clara across the kitchen in the spring morning light in the second blue dress. 20 years and 4 children and a whole life past the first one. And he thought of a summer afternoon and a dress in a window and a dressmaker's careful, deliberate words and a 12-mile ride on a feeling, and the gate he had closed behind him when he rode in and never truly left. "She does," he said. "She absolutely does." Clara shook her head at him slightly, the way she always did when she was pleased and not going to admit the full extent of it, and the morning light lay across the kitchen floor in long golden bars, and outside the window the Texas spring was arriving in waves of color across the pasture, and the windmill turned over Archer's Fork, and the cattle moved in the middle distance. And Jasper Thatcher sat in the house that was his home with his youngest daughter on his knee and his wife in a blue dress, and the complete and permanent knowledge that he had followed one impulsive instinct 20 years ago, and landed, with perfect and undeserved accuracy, exactly where he was always meant to be. He would spend the rest of his days in this place, on this land with this woman, and it would be enough. It would be, in fact, exactly more than enough. It would be everything. The seasons continued to turn over the Thatcher homestead at Archer's Fork with the unhurried and reliable rhythm of the Texas hill country. And Jasper and Clara Thatcher grew older together in the way that people who have loved each other well are granted the privilege of doing, with increasing depth and ease, each year adding layers of understanding and shared history that made the next year richer than the one before. The ranch prospered, and the children grew, and the blue dress, both of them, hung carefully on their respective pegs and came out for the occasions that warranted them. And Mrs. Pemberton, retired and contented in her small house in Millhaven, lived to see the Thatcher grandchildren, because Thomas married a woman from a neighboring settlement in 1898, and his first child, a boy named Henry, arrived in the winter of 1899. Robust and loud, and clearly going to be a person of considerable character. Clara held Thomas's son on the day he was born, in the room where Thomas himself had been born 23 years earlier, and looked at the small face with the particular expression of a woman who has earned every line and every year that life has given her, and who regards the continuation of the family line with a satisfaction that goes deeper than words can comfortably reach. She handed Henry Thatcher to Jasper, and Jasper held his grandson the way he had held each of his own children, with a care and a steadiness that came from knowing that what you are holding is the whole of what matters. And he looked at Clara across the room with the look they had been exchanging across rooms for 25 years, and she looked back at him. And everything that needed to be said was said in that exchange without a word being spoken. It was the last day of 1899, and outside the window of the stone house at Archer's Fork, the Texas hill country was going to sleep under a winter sky that was clear and cold and full of stars, and the 20th century was arriving in one day's time, and the windmill turned slowly in the night wind over the creek, and somewhere in the house a baby was crying, and a father was pacing, and a grandmother was putting on coffee with the efficiency of someone who has done this before. And a grandfather was standing at the window looking out at the familiar dark land, with his hand resting on the cold glass, and his heart so full that there was nowhere left for anything else to go. He had ridden 12 miles on a feeling. He had stood at a widow's gate in the summer heat of 1874 with his hat in his hands and his heart in his throat. He had fixed her fences and eaten at her table and watched the fireflies come up over Archer's Fork and held her hands across a lamplight kitchen and said his vows in a small hall in Millhaven with Mrs. Pemberton in the front row, wearing the expression of a woman who is entirely satisfied with the consequences of her own perceptiveness. He had loved Clara Sawyer through 25 years and 4 children and a dozen hard seasons and a dozen good ones, and through grief and joy, and the slow, steady building work of a life made deliberately and with care. And she had loved him back in the clear, direct, unwavering way that was entirely her own, without performance or pretense, with her whole self given to the thing the way she gave herself to everything she chose completely and without reservation. It was enough. It was everything. It was precisely and perfectly the life that a man who had once been lonely beyond the telling of it had never quite allowed himself to imagine, until a blue dress in a dressmaker's window had stopped him in the road and changed the direction of his whole existence. He turned from the window and went to find his wife, and she was in the kitchen as he had known she would be, pouring coffee and moving with the quiet efficiency that was one of the first things he had noticed about her, and one of the things he had never stopped admiring. And she handed him a cup without asking if he wanted one because she always knew. And he stood beside her at the kitchen counter of the house they had built together, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood like that in the warm kitchen of the last night of the century, surrounded by the sounds of their family, with the whole of everything good and real and fully theirs settled around them like the walls of the house itself, solid and standing, and made to last.